Good evening. We begin tonight with trade as an instrument of foreign policy. The White House is using the renewal of trade to reward the South African government. Congress is in the process of using trade to penalize China for its human rights policies. 5 years ago, Congress decided that the best way to force the South African government to change its racial policies was to apply the economic squeeze. No trading in everything from oil and steel to gold coins and computers. Economic sanctions, in other words. Today, declaring that South Africa has undergone a profound transformation, President Bush removed them. So we begin at the White House, and here's ABC's Britt Hume.
The president came to announce a decision that had never been in doubt.
And I have today just signed and issued an executive order terminating the sanctions against South Africa.
Perhaps to cushion what some black South Africans would see as a blow, Mr. Bush phoned Nelson Mandela ahead of time to tell him of the decision. Mr. Bush said he is doubling to $80 million annual U.S. aid to South Africa's blacks, and he tried to answer congressional critics of his sanctions decision.
I say, look, one, we're complying with the law you people wrote, and secondly, I happen to think it's the right thing to do. I believe that this will result in more progress toward racial equity instead of less.
I'm not surprised by the president's actions, but I am clearly gravely disappointed by his actions.
And Mr. Bush's congressional critics see him coming down against the interests of blacks on more than just the sanctions. Some also say he's playing racial politics by raising the quota issue in the Civil Rights Bill debate. And they see politics in the Supreme Court nomination of the conservative Judge Clarence Thomas. They charge a lack of moral leadership.
It sounds like you're trying to have it both ways. Lip service to equality and political maneuvering against it. What does your record mean? What have you stood for?
The president doesn't accept such charges, of course, but he acknowledged today that they do worry him.
You put your finger on something that does concern me, because this tremendous, this kind of drop of water on the rock, it could make a difference. But I'm going to take my case every chance I get, and this is a good opportunity right here, to black Americans and say, hey, listen, we got a good record on civil rights, and we're going to continue it.
The president believes that, but this would probably not be the day for the administration to take a poll on it among American civil rights leaders. Ending the sanctions is technically an international diplomatic issue. But as today's reaction shows, it is also a powerful domestic political issue. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
President Bush says that lifting the sanctions will lead to more economic opportunity for all South Africans. And it is true that many blacks in South Africa are hoping now they'll be able to get a job. Here's ABC's Richard Sergey.
You see them almost everywhere, waiting patiently on street corners, along dusty roads, hoping to be lucky enough to get work, even for just a day.
Thank you. That's it. Sorry?
We don't have houses, don't have any accommodation, we don't have jobs, don't have even food.
For blacks, making a living has always been tough in South Africa, even tougher in the 5 years since the U.S. imposed sanctions, resulting in the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs when big American companies pulled out. Mikana Shabalala thinks President Bush's announcement today is long overdue. The Soweto restaurant has had a difficult time because so many of his customers are without jobs and money.
Bringing money into this country is what is needed. The majority of the people are just ready to develop.
So far, the major opposition here to lifting sanctions comes from the African National Congress, which wants them to continue until blacks are allowed to vote.
Apartheid still remains the order of the day in this country. We applaud what de Klerk has done, but apartheid is not over until it is fully over.
But many blacks who have had no work for years think the time for sanctions has passed.
Maybe it will be more money and more jobs.
American companies are expected to return slowly, waiting to see whether stability returns and whether the ANC, if it comes to power, follows through on its intention to take over and nationalize key industries. Those decisions will help determine whether these people will continue to depend on luck for their survival. Richard Sergey, ABC News, Johannesburg.
Official reaction from South Africa today. The Foreign Minister, Pick Botha, says that lifting sanctions should benefit all South Africans. The leader of the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, says Mr. Bush acted prematurely. Mr. Mandela and Mr. Botha will be Ted Koppel's guests later this evening on Nightline. And now to the other matter of trade and politics, China. For several months now, there's been a running battle between the president and many members of Congress about the most favored nation trading status which China currently enjoys. The president's critics, citing China's human rights policies, believe it should not be continued. And in the House of Representatives today, his critics prevailed. Here's ABC's Jim Wooten.
Once in a blue moon, it happens. Here was the president's pal and fellow Republican, Jerry Solomon of New York, insisting that China's current trade status with America should end immediately, if not sooner. Not what Mr. Bush has in mind.
Let us not forget that the Chinese government is a vicious communist dictatorship, and we have no business being a partner in keeping these thugs propped up in power, which is what we're doing.
And most Democrats couldn't resist the opportunity to stick it to the president, even if it meant voting for a Republican bill. Barney Frank of Massachusetts, for example.
The position of the Bush administration is very clear. Human rights, schmooman rights.
And likewise, his Democratic colleague, Larry Smith of Florida.
History now beseeches us to vote for the Solomon resolution to deny them MFN. It's the only thing an American should do.
Only 112 Republicans stayed with the president. 51 abandoned him. And the bill, which cancels China's preferential trade status at the end of September, passed by 19 votes. Then the Senate proceeded immediately to Democratic legislation, which would give China another year to clean up its Human Rights Act.
It's 1 year, China, 1 year.
Doesn't sound logical, but the Senate will probably have a choice between penalizing China now or next year. The president will veto either version, but China's still sufficiently worried about the Senate that it's hired a powerful PR firm in Washington to concentrate on 34 senators, just enough to protect that veto and China's most favored nation status. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
When we come back, some of the other news. How an over-the-counter painkiller and exercise may be the best way to fight osteoarthritis. On the American agenda tonight, oil and the environment in Alaska. And getting ready for the solar eclipse, nature's most spectacular light show.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Just for Men.